Hello, welcome to World Civilizations up to 1500. Now, this is session 2 of the fifth topic of the semester titled China, Three Ways of Thought. And we're going to proceed looking at part 1. We're going to see the formative era of Chinese civilization. We're going to look at another very important dynasty, the Zhou Dynasty, that is going to really establish the kind of the standard norms and practices of Chinese civilization. And then after we look at that, we're going to move into part 2, titled Three Ways of Thought. We're going to look at the emergence of the most important philosophical schools of thought of ancient China: Confucianism, Daoism, and Legalism. And those are going to be the standard ways of thinking in Chinese society and culture that will remain pretty much all the way to, let us just say, the present day. Again, they're going to really establish the classical outlook of Chinese thought and Chinese culture. And it's very important to really understand the subsequent dynasties and the subsequent periods of time in Chinese history. Okay, so let's look at our slide. So we finish in session 1 looking at the Shang Dynasty. The Shang Dynasty, as I said in session 1, was a period of time when there's plenty of archaeological and historical records, again, for us to actually assess that period of time that was foundational in Chinese history. Because prior to the Shang Dynasty, we looked at this mythical time, around 3000 BC, there was a dynasty called the Shi, or the Shiite dynasty, that gave rise to agriculture. It gave rise to the proto-Chinese script, for example, irrigation systems, canals, for example, calendars. And all of those innovations were attributed to celestial emperors that had come to Earth in order to establish, again, the basis of Chinese civilization. It's more of a kind of like a mythical history, so to speak, that dynasty. But the Shang Dynasty was very important because this is going to be the very first kingdom that is very well documented, that was governed by a group of nomads that took over the region, and they installed a monarchy. And this monarchy is going to carry on with Chinese innovation, some technological innovations as well. We're going to see the establishment of a religious worldview. We looked at back in session 1. Animism. There was also practice of fertility dances and human sacrifice as well during that period of time. So human sacrifice was part of the religious worldview of the Shang Dynasty. Now, as I mentioned, that dynasty is going to come to an end, and it's going to be replaced by another royal dynasty, the Zhou, that are also, as we'll see, nomadic, and they're going to take over the region and really expand the so-called Middle Kingdom, as it became known. Ancient China was known as the Middle Kingdom. And so this is now a new dynasty that is going to rule this region of East Asia, as you can see in this map, and this is going to be the domain of the Zhou dynasty. Encompassed the regions between the Yellow River and the Yangtze River, and they're beginning to also expand their borders north and south during this period of time. And as we'll see, this is again going to be the longest dynasty that ruled China. Now, they ruled for, roughly speaking, over 8 centuries, again from 1027 to 221 BC. All right, so let's look at the Zhou Dynasty. As I mentioned a moment ago, the Zhou Dynasty were nomadic groups, nomadic tribes that lived in the northern part of Asia, in what is today Mongolia. Okay, they were Turkic nomads. They had domesticated the horse. They were excellent warriors. As a matter of fact, this is a warrior clan, and it gave them a great advantage over the sedentary populations because they could move in horse rather rapidly. They could conquer the sedentary societies, the farming communities of the Yangtze River and Yellow River. The Zhou Dynasty will be conquered by the Turkic nomads, the Zhou, and they're going to install themselves as the new rulers of the realm. Again, so they're going to start a whole new dynasty. Keep that in mind because the nomadic tribal groups of Northern Asia, what is called Mongolia, for example, and even Central Asia, are going to play a very key role in the development of China's civilization and Chinese history. Those are groups that invaded from time to time China. Some of them ended up conquering China, installing themselves as dynasties, as we'll see later on in this course. Towards the end of the course, the Mongols, for example, they also invaded China, took over China, and built one of the largest, perhaps the largest land-based empires that the world has ever seen. In other instances, the nomads exerted influences on Chinese culture by bringing into China some of their skills and weapons that the Chinese later on adopted as well. So again, nomadic groups will play a critical role in China's history, such as, for example, the Zhou Dynasty. They defeated the Shang, and this was really a conquest. Okay? They raided that kingdom, they conquered, and the territory took over. And instead of eliminating the Shang culture, that's another thing that nomadic groups in China that often invade China, like the Mongols later on, for example, they end up, despite the fact that they install themselves as the new rulers of China, they end up being acculturated. Instead of them forcing their culture on the Chinese people, what happens is the reverse, is that the invaders that install themselves as rulers of China end up absorbing the culture, and they're trying also to expand and disseminate the culture far and wide as well. Okay, so they adopt the Shan culture. This is a similar process that occurred in Mesopotamia that we looked at in the second topic when we look at ancient Sumer, for example, the mother culture of Mesopotamia that was later on invaded by other nomadic warrior clans like the Assyrians and the Babylonians that built an empire all over Mesopotamia, but they ended up adopting the culture of Sumer, and they spread the culture of Sumer as well. Again, so this is a similar process that is occurring in this part of the world. All right, so the Zhou Dynasty is going to rework the political administration of this kingdom that they're now ruling over. They introduce a new political organization that is going to be very different from the Shang political structure. Remember that the Shang political structure was a kind of absolutism. The monarch was the absolute ruler of the domain, and he ordered his warriors to move in different directions and collect tribute, and the warriors were totally loyal and obedient to him because they recognized the divinity, so to speak, of the monarch, the Shang monarch. Here, we're going to see a reformulation of that system, in that the Zhou Dynasty is not going to continue with that absolute monarchy, but instead is going to decentralize the government. Okay, so this is a decentralized state, in that by this time, what we see is that the different regions of China, or what it was called the Middle Kingdom, were now largely governed by a series of clans, so to speak. Okay, so we're going to see the rise of regional clans across the realm. And what the Zhou Dynasty is going to do is that it's going to create a kind of feudal state, allowing the local feudal lords, the landlords, in other words, of every region, to retain their power. The king is not going to acquire this absolute power and is going to dictate law to everybody else, but rather he's going to share power with the regional clans, particularly the leaders of those clans. So that's what a feudal state is. In feudalism is a system in which there's a power dynamics between, let's say, the king, the monarch, who shares power with a series of landlords that are controlling populations in different areas, and the local feudal lords exert significant authority over their own domains. Of course, they have to be loyal to the king, pay tribute, etc. Indeed, but they do exercise significant power in their own right. Okay, so that's what a feudal society is. So we see feudalism now. Okay, so it's a feudal society. The king is not that all powerful. The local lords are exercising authority in their own domain, and there's like a sort of political division across this kingdom. Every regional clan that is the dominant clan is going to be given a certain territory for them to control. So they control the territory, they extract tribute from the population, they make their own rules at the local level. Of course, they still have to swear allegiance, if you will, to the Zhou king. But this is the kind of system that is going to remain in place for many, many centuries. Now, what this feudal system is going to do ultimately, and this is what feudalism does anyways, in wherever it arises, like in Europe, for example, is that this often leads to the creation of a landed aristocracy. So the patriarch, in other words, the male heir to the clan, he is the father figure of all the people that lives below him. And this is in a very kind of real sense, in that clans are kin groups, extended families, so to speak, that encompasses many, many, many different families, all coming together under the premise that they all share common ancestors. That's what a clan is, again. So kinship is at the very basis of clan organization. So the most powerful family is the ruler of the entire clan. And the male figure that leads that family, he is the patriarch of the entire clan. He is indeed the local lord, second only to the king in this case. So that's really what an aristocracy is. We have now a hierarchical society in which families are ranked according to lineage, how far back they go in connecting to ancestors. Okay, so the most powerful family has a direct connection, direct line to the founder of the clan. So they control the land, they control the territories, they control the population in this case. Okay, so there's a hierarchy, in other words, of families all ranked in that way. And those positions of authority are inherited from generation to generation. Again, so this is an aristocracy of birth. People inherit their social standing from their fathers, and there's no way out. Okay, so if you were born at the very bottom of society, you were one of the families that do not really exercise significant power or authority. It's just a family of peasants. you will remain in that level of society. You will remain a peasant for the rest of your life. Likewise, again, if you are born into the landed elite that control the land, again, you're going to become a landowner and so on. Again, so that's what an aristocracy is. And primogeniture is a principle by which the male heir, the eldest son in this case, is the one that inherits all the power, all the prestige, all the land, all the domain that the family rules. Again, so it's very important for families during this time to have a male heir so they can continue the heritage of ruling over the clan. Again, so that's what primogeniture is. Again, so we see society becoming a little bit more complex in that regard. It's a feudal society. There's a political division between different regional clans, and of course this leads to a landed aristocracy that is passing on their authority, their rights to in a line of male succession in this case. So we see about 11 different political regions, each controlled by different clans during the Zhou era. Again, so that's the kind of feudal society, the feudal organization that we see as the Zhou come into power. And as we'll see, this is going to be really problematic later on because at some point, those regional clans began to compete with one another over boundaries, over territories, over resources, and also as they grow in power, they're going to also challenge the authority of the monarch. So perhaps this was not a very wise decision, by the Zhou, because as we'll see in just a few moments, this is going to lead to warfare eventually. Okay, all right. So as I mentioned, at the very bottom of society is a hierarchy. Okay, society is a hierarchy. We're going to see that the vast majority of the population are the peasants. Ultimately, this is an agricultural civilization. So most of the people that lived in China, in this so-called Middle Kingdom, are peasants. Over 90% of the population, again, are peasants. So it's only a tiny minority of individuals that are part of the landed aristocracy. And the peasantry, in this case, have lost all entitlements and rights to the land, because now the land is now the possession, the property of the landowners, the aristocracy, the nobility. And because they have lost all their entitlements to the land, now they find themselves living in the land of somebody else, in this case, the local lord. And as such, they must pay tribute to the local lord in order to stay on the land. See it as a kind of like a form of rent of sorts. Okay, the land is not yours, but in order for you to stay on the land and work and and grow crops and sustain your family, you must pay tribute. Okay, to the real ultimate supreme lord of the domain, which is the leader of the clan, but also the monarch, the Zhou Dynasty as well. So they must provide labor and crops. In other words, that's the kind of payment that people must provide. You must labor in the land of the local lord. You must assist your local lord with whatever he needs in terms of needing you for construction work or clearing land or growing crops. And also you must share a certain percentage of your harvest with that local lord and also with the Zhou Dynasty as well. So again, this is a tribute system. This is again integral to any feudal society, any feudal system, is that in feudalism, people are paying tribute to a landed aristocracy. Okay, so this is again the structure, the new structure that the Zhou implement. Now, because there's a higher degree of management and organization, there's a distribution of power, and the regional clans are pretty much commissioning the labor in order to build canals and irrigation systems and put people to work and grow crops, there's going to be an increase in agricultural production, and with that, we're going to see an increase of population as well. We're going to see a population growth to the point that by 600 BC, there'll be already 20 million people living in the Middle Kingdom. So that's significant for the time that we're looking at here. We're talking about 6 centuries before the birth of Christ. China, or ancient China, was already reaching 20 million. Okay, so perhaps that speaks for the success, if you will, of their engineering works, the hydraulic systems of irrigation, the organization of labor, and so on again. So they were rather successful in that regard. That led to more and more people being born, and because there's more food. Now, the Zhou also introduced new political ideas in ancient China. Ideas that will become classical ideas, not only during the Zhou period, but even in subsequent eras as well. So all dynasties that are going to come after the Zhou dynasty will continue relying on the ideas that the Zhou dynasty introduced, particularly the political ideas. For example, the Zhou dynasty introduced a new political ideology that served as the basis for legitimizing the rule of the monarch. Okay? It's political legitimacy, that is to say, it's a political theory, it's a political philosophy, a political idea that served the main purpose of providing the king with the justification for his rule. That the king was the rightful ruler of the domain, because according to the Zhou, they are introducing the notion that the king, the monarch, themselves in this case, are given the power by heaven to rule on earth. This is what is called the mandate of heaven. Okay, so this is the central notion of this new political ideology. It's called the mandate of heaven. The Zhou introduce a new deity that is going to replace the deity of the Shang dynasty, Shangdi. That deity is going to be replaced with a new deity called Heaven. Maybe it was a sky god, again, because those were actually nomadic peoples, and all nomadic peoples around the world actually deified the sky, served as the guide for their migrations. So they believed the sky was their god. So again, the Zhou introduced in China the idea that, well, the divinity is heaven, or the sky god, and the king is the son of heaven. And as such, the king is being given the right, the power by heaven to rule over the earth. That is the mandate of heaven. Okay? Now, the way this worked is that that mandate of heaven was not to remain forever. It will remain in place only if the ruler created stability, order, technological innovation, abundance of crops, and so on. So when there was harmony in the world, when there was order and stability and so on, that indicated that the king still enjoyed the mandate of heaven. That was an indication, according to this philosophy that they introduced. However, when things went wrong, when there's a crisis in the world, when there are, for example, foreign invasions, when there's an epidemic, for example, when there's a drought, when there are calamities happening in nature, when there's social unrest, for example, disorder, in other words, instability in different parts of the realm, that was an indication that the mandate of heaven had been withdrawn. In other words, that the king was no longer the rightful ruler of the realm. And why that happened? Well, it happened perhaps because the monarchy had grown corrupt, or had grown incompetent, inept, wicked, or evil, etc. There was something wrong, in other words, with the monarchy in their moral behavior, in their moral makeup, that heaven, the sky god, in this case is divinity, decided to remove that blessing from the king, so everything started to disintegrate again in the world. And so once that occurred, once you see that disintegration taking place, the crisis, the instability, and so on, then another very powerful clan could claim or could challenge, the monarchy in power to remove it. Because they said, well, you have lost your mandate of heaven. You're no longer the legitimate heir or the legitimate ruler of the realm. So it is okay then to revolt in order to remove you from power. So another dynasty can come in and be given the blessing of heaven so they can rule China as heaven will like it to be in a very orderly way. Okay? Create stability, create abundance, and the like again. So the Zhou Dynasty introduced this idea as a form of political propaganda to legitimize their own rule, because they themselves came into China to conquer it, and they removed the Shang Dynasty by force. So in order to appear as legitimate, they introduced this ideology saying, well, in reality, the Shang Dynasty was removed by heaven. They lost their mandate of heaven. They had grown corrupt, inept, inefficient, etc. And we were just one of those clans that came into this moment and removed them. And instead, we received the blessing of heaven to rule China. So we are the legitimate rulers, in other words. We have received the mandate of heaven. So they used they craft that ideology for themselves. But as we'll see, subsequent dynasties that ruled China continue using the same ideology. Okay, that they have been given the mandate of heaven to rule the realm as well. So again, this was really the underpinning of Chinese political philosophy when it came to why do we have a monarchy? Why do we have a particular royal dynasty in power? Well, because of the mandate of heaven, in other words, okay? All right, so this is something, of course, of an innovation. Remember that the monarchs in China are innovators. They're innovators of new ideas and technologies, public works, and the like. Again, that is one of their major contributions, is driving history forward in that regard. They're going to introduce a series of political reforms during their reign that is also going to transform the political makeup, the political structure of the bureaucracy particularly. One of the things that they're going to do is that they're going to separate religion from politics. The kingdom is going to be administered in a more this worldly way, what is called secular. Secularism is this worldly, approach, this worldly principle of trying to administer the kingdom, trying to administer the government, not so much by bringing in priests in order to consult the spirits and the divinities and trying to perform a series of rituals in order for things to go well, but rather trying to bring experts, in other words, people that have specific knowledge and skills in engineering, in finances, for example, in tribute collection, public works, in architecture, you name it, so we can actually build a society in a more materialistic way, as opposed to trying to remain in kind of a mythical land of sorts again. So this is a totally new approach, again, that the government is now going to be run by experts and scientists and engineers and so on, people of knowledge, as opposed to priests, the way it was during the Zhou Dynasty. So we see the secularization of government. We're going to see the introduction of scholar administrators, replacing the Zhang priest to carry out the functions of the state. This is a new class of scholar administrators that the Zhou bring in. And many of the former practices that were carried out by the Zhang Dynasty in order to craft laws. Before they will craft a law, they will have to bring in the priest, the diviners, as they were called, in order to predict the future. Okay, there was a certain preoccupations with knowing the future, divining the future. The practice of writing messages on bone oracles, again, inscribing those messages, the questions to the spirits, throwing them on the fire, and then the priest will have to read, the answer of the spirits before any law was crafted in those common procedure during the Zhang Dynasty. All of those practices are going to be abolished, including the human sacrifices. There were public ceremonies that the Zhang Dynasty practiced in the past, where there were dancers, and at the end of the dance, they were burned alive to the fertility deities. All of those human sacrifices are going to be suspended as well. So there is significant change taking place during this dynasty. And also there's going to be a flourishing of secular philosophies, these worldly philosophies. People are beginning to engage in thinking about the world around them, how to create a better society, how to create a more orderly world, and so on. People are inquiring into the workings of nature in a more materialistic way, as opposed to trying to include things like spirits and entities that are acting on the natural world. Of course, all of those religious ideas will continue very much alive and well and present in the minds of the general population. But what we're going to see is a group of scholars slash philosophers that are trying to move away from the animism, from the mysticism of nature, and they're trying to study nature in a more secular way, in a more naturalistic, materialistic way. During the Zhou Dynasty, we're going to see also the expansion of the bureaucracy. There's going to be more agencies created because now there's a group of scholar administrators. We're going to see the growth, the expansion of the bureaucracy. It's going to become a massive institution in ancient China. That is going to acquire significant power along with the monarch and along with the landed aristocracy. So once again, there are different institutions of power arising in China. It's not just the monarch anymore. There is the landed elite, but there's also a bureaucracy that they're going to exercise significant power in their own right as well. And the bureaucracy is going to remain a constant across millennia, across Chinese history. Despite that dynasties come and go, the bureaucracy will remain as one of the most powerful institutions of ancient China. As a matter of fact, it provided so much stability in China, this new bureaucracy, that it allowed the Zhou Dynasty to be the longest dynasty in Chinese history. They ruled China for over 8 centuries again. So no other dynasty ruled China for so long again. So those are fundamental institutions that are giving rise to the classical expression of Chinese civilization. Now, during the Zhou Dynasty, we see another very classical formation of Chinese civilization, and that is a new worldview is on the rise. This is where we're going to get, those classical symbols and ideas that are expressing the way Chinese society is beginning to conceive the universe and the world around them. For example, during the Zhou Dynasty, we see the emergence of, for example, this vision of the universe as a universe composed of complementary polarities. Okay, complementary polarities in this case. That, of course, there's a polarity in nature. There's a polarity in the universe, but instead of those two different poles being opposed to one another, that they instead complement each other. This is the symbol of the yin and yang. Again, this is a cosmology. This is a way of looking at the cosmos in general. It's called the principle of yin and yang, complementary polarity. Okay, that's what it means. It's a symbol. For example, the Chinese came to terms after observing nature. Remember, they're starting to look at nature in a more materialistic way, more secular way. And so what we call scientific today. So they're coming to the realization that in nature there are poles. For example, there's the North Pole and the South Pole. But also there's heat and cold. There's fire and there's ice, for example. There's light, there's night, or day and night, light and dark, for example. You can see that again in everything, that there's always a polarity existing, in nature everywhere. But once again, instead of those two poles being opposed or at war with one another, that they instead harmonize, they come together and form a whole, a unity, that is to say. So this is again, part of the general worldview of classical Chinese civilization that will remain for thousands of years, even to this very present day. Okay, the yin and yang. From the yin and yang, we see other concepts being developed, like feng shui. Okay, feng shui is a sort of naturalistic philosophy or naturalistic science. It has often been termed as geomancy, Chinese geomancy or feng shui. It's a natural balance philosophy that proposes that in order for human beings to create a successful enterprise, a successful household, a successful kingdom or temple, community, village, you name it, that it must be aligned with the forces of nature. It must be working with the rhythms and the forces of nature as opposed to be working against it, in other words. So we must align with nature. The way nature works, the way energy moves, that like a river, for example, river, you can see a river that it has a flow of water, and instead of swimming against it, we need to be in favor of the current and go with the flow, so to speak, because that is going to aid us, is going to create a more propitious environment for growth, for abundance, for health, for well-being. Okay, they believe that this energy that flows within nature is called qi. Okay, that is the life force energy. It flows within our bodies as well. We have a flow of qi, in other words, but it flows in nature as well. I just gave an example of a creek or river. You can see, of course, the water, again, flowing, for example. But the energy also flows, for example, in the four cardinal directions. You can see, for example, energy flowing from east to west, because that's the path of the sun. You can see that's the natural path of energy. That is the source of life, the source of heat, the source of life for the planet comes from the sun. So it rises in the east and it sets in the west. So obviously that's a current. That is like a river. That's a flow of energy. So we must direct our lives. We must build our houses. We must build our temples. We must build our cities, if you will, to align with that current of energy as well. The other current of energy is the north and south current. Again, the polarity between the North Pole and the South Pole as well. That creates another current of qi, again, in the planet. Again, so the ancient Chinese philosophers / scientists are realizing that there is really a life force in the world that we must take advantage of. We must use to our advantage if we are to be successful growing crops and having good health, a successful marriage, for example, a successful kingdom, and the like, that we must build our civilization according to the flow of energy of nature. So during the Zhou Dynasty, there was a great concern to orient all the buildings as they begin to build a series of public buildings for the bureaucracy, for example, building palaces for the monarchy, or temples, for instance, or people just building their homes in their villages. They wanted to orient their buildings according to the four cardinal points in order to take advantage of the so-called qi, and this life force energy. And during the Zhou Dynasty, buildings were facing south. And the reason why they were facing south is because China is located in the northern hemisphere. So from their perspective, the sun, although it rises in the east, it rises from the southeast, as a matter of fact. From the southeast, of course, from their perspective, because they're in the northern hemisphere. Okay? So they want to take advantage of the flow of energy coming from the sun. So they want to make sure that all their main entrances of their houses and palaces and temples, etc., administrative buildings, etc., was in the south, in order for the qi of the sun to move inside the house, and of course, for them to be irradiated by this energy, energized, and they believe that that will bring them success in everything that will do, everything that will do. Again, this is the kind of worldview that we see on the rise in ancient China, again, trying to work with nature in this regard. There's also an understanding of time. People are observing the cycles of time as they're governed by the movement of celestial bodies. They're forming calendars, and they're going to come up with a calendar that is going to be the guide of Chinese civilization for literally thousands of years, ever since the inception of this calendar back during this time of the Zhou Dynasty. It's a 12-year cycle that apparently is governed by the movement of the moon. So it's, again, at the very basis, there is an understanding that the moon exerts significant influence on human affairs, on human personality traits, human behavior, human societies as well, that the moon is regulating, again, our rhythms and our cycles. And they come up with this idea that there is a 12-year cycle governed by the moon, and each year is very different because it carries a different energy or different qi of sorts. So it is being given a different sign, the sign of different animals. So people born in any specific year under the symbol of an animal is going to carry on the traits of that animal, the energy, the skills, the strengths, and even the weaknesses, again, of that particular animal. So again, it was a sort of a system of astrology that was used in order to understand human psychology, human behavior, but also personal destiny. What was really the destiny of an individual being born under this sign? Was this individual was going to be an artisan, a merchant, a philosopher, for example, a warrior, a leader, etc. They were really guided by that principle, trying to, understand time as it connected with human destiny. Okay. Now, at some point, the Zhou Dynasty is going to come to a sharp decline. We're going to see that there will be nomadic invasions. Again, this is going to be a constant from the north. There will be nomadic groups, a series of nomadic groups that will continue to raid settlements in China, and this is going to destabilize the dynasty. But most importantly, what really ended up destabilizing the Zhou dynasty was this system of decentralization. You know, that the region, the Middle Kingdom, is going to be broken up into a series of local feudal lords that are going to start exercising significant authority to the point that they're building a kingdom in their own domain. So instead of having one unified kingdom governed by a single monarch, we're going to see that this Middle Kingdom will be broken politically into about 6 or 7, to be more precise, there were 7 kingdoms. Okay, 7 kingdoms. So out of one, we see China being broken up into 7 kingdoms, and now those kingdoms are at war with one another. Okay, they're waging war on each other, and they're also challenging the monarchy as well. This is a time period of ancient China that was very convoluted. It was a period of chaos and disorder. It was called the Warring State period. It lasted from 475 to 221 BC. So there's warfare on the rise. There are marching armies attacking each other's territories again. And so this becomes now normalized, so to speak. We see the rise of militarism during this time in ancient China. You know, large armies are raised on each side, and they're going to be used to be marching into the other's territories to extend their borders and challenge the authority of the monarch at the same time. This is a time when we see the development of very sophisticated military technologies as well, like the crossbow and shields, for example. There was the need for people to innovate, of course, military technologies because they're now at war. And this is, again, an ongoing process that lasted for more than 2 centuries. So military innovation, military technologies is going to be also fostered by all those 7 kingdoms, including the monarchy as well. What this did is that for the first time, we're going to see that those generals that were successful in invading and conquering their neighbors are going to start earning significant privileges from their local kings. Military expertise is going to be rewarded, and that was a very good way to advance in the social ladder because it was impossible in the past to advance in the social ladder. Again, it was a rigid aristocracy. People inherited their position by birth, so there was no way to move in society. But now there's an opportunity to move upwards and become part of the elite, so to speak, and that is to join the military and become very skilled in warfare and win battles, in other words. So again, there's going to be that, again, rewarding military expertise. What this is going to do is that this is going to lead to increasing moral decay and corruption in the Zhou dynasty. The Zhou dynasty was dealing with a lot of problems during this time. It was trying to bribe individuals, bribe generals, again, keep them content, give them, entitlements to land and so on. So again, this is going to become a very corrupt system from this point onwards. So as you can see, the mandate of heaven seems to be coming to an end slowly but surely. There's a lot of instability in the realm. There's warfare, there's corruption, and of course there are foreign invaders as well, invading China from the north. So again, people are beginning to question the legitimacy of the Zhou. But what's important now is that during the Warring States period, we're going to see the flourishing of philosophical schools, particularly again because people are trying to deal with the chaos. they're trying to understand it, and they're trying to come up with ways, new philosophies that can perhaps serve to end the conflict and recreate a new society. So this is what we're going to be looking at here again in part 2, the 3 ways of thought: Confucianism, legalism, and Daoism. Again, those are going to be the classical philosophical schools of thought of ancient China that will have the greatest influence and impact in Chinese politics, in Chinese philosophy, Chinese society, even in Chinese religious thought as well. They're going to become central, again, to the way people are going to interpret the world around them. So, once again, the background of those 3 philosophical schools is precisely that those philosophical schools are arising during the Warring States period. Okay, this is really a time of conflict, chaos, confusion, and this is going to lead to a sort of reaction to that chaos and confusion. Again, we're going to see particularly the sons of merchants, in this case, those that were kind of well off, spending a lot of time thinking, seeing the world around them, and trying to understand why people were fighting, but also how could we organize society in a new way to create social order. So one of the central themes of all of those schools of thought we're going to look at here, Confucianism, Daoism, and legalism, is how to really create social order. Okay, what are the different ways, or what is the main way to create social order? Those were not the only philosophical schools that flourished during this time. They're going to become the central one, the most dominant. But in fact, during the Warring States period, there were hundreds of schools of thought flourishing all over the region. Okay, but only 3 will emerge dominant and the most influential again. So this is a time of an intellectual renaissance of sorts again. So the very first school of thought that we're going to see flourishing during this time was Confucianism. Confucianism was a philosophy that was formulated by Confuci. That was his name. You know, he's often called Confucius, but in actuality, his Chinese name was Confuci, Master Confuci. And he lived during the Warring States period, more or less, again, from 551 to 479 BC. So he was present during this time, and he witnessed a lot of the carnage and destruction that was occurring as those kingdoms were waging war against each other. Again, so he witnessed firsthand, you know, the chaos and the confusion and the great destruction. And he was very distraught about that. It affected him deeply. He wanted to move into the administration. He actually applied to a post, a bureaucratic post within the Zhou Dynasty. He couldn't get into the bureaucracy, so he decided to instead spend most of his time and for the remainder of his life thinking and devising philosophies or a school of thought that will preserve Chinese civilization and restore order and stability in the realm. He believed that the Zhou era, at least the initial centuries before the Warring State periods, was like a sort of golden age of order. That this was an unprecedented time of abundance and innovation and stability, that, you know, China was really, again, very well organized during that time. So he really believed that this was the way that we should live. We perhaps need to go back to this time, you know, and restore it. So as a result of that, he started really formulating a new philosophy that is not going to be a religious philosophy. He's not going to be including any ideas about spirits and the divinities, etc., but rather this is more of a social philosophy. Okay, a philosophy about society, how to create a society in which there is stability, and order. So his philosophy is going to be a philosophy that proposes that the best of all possible societies, the ideal, perfect society, is one in which people are organized in a hierarchy. Once again, we go back to the Zhou, remember the hierarchical society. Okay, people ranked from top to bottom in this case. And in this way, by organizing society as a hierarchy, that we're going to restore order. Okay, so it's a social philosophy of order and hierarchy. He believed that the universe, that the way the universe works, that the universe is structured, is that the universe is actually a hierarchy. Okay, that's the universe. Okay, you can see that, for example, looking at, the cosmos. You have the planet, for example. Well, the planet can be seen as being kind of below the hierarchy. Above the planet are the sun, the moon, the planets. They're above in the hierarchy. And then at the very top, of course, the stars and the constellations. So it's like a sort of hierarchical organization, so to speak, in the cosmos. So he believed that human societies should imitate the structure of the universe. Remember, we must align with nature. We here must build our civilization according to how nature works. So if nature or the cosmos is a hierarchy, we must organize society as a hierarchy as well. And so he's really taking this idea precisely from the clans, in this case, of China. Remember, the clans were really a hierarchy of families. And even within each family, there's a hierarchy. At the very top is the father, and then below the father is the mother, and then below the mother are all the siblings. So there's a hierarchy, even within a single family. Now, in a clan, you see an organization of different families that are ranked from top to bottom as well. The oldest families that go back to the ancestors are placed at the very top. They're the rulers as well. So he's really taking the family structure and the clan structure to be the blueprint for the structure of Chinese society in general. In other words, he believes that Chinese society as a whole is a gigantic clan. We are, he said, an extended family. We're all connected with each other through a system of common ancestors. We all share a common heritage, common past, and common history, common traditions, but most importantly, common ancestors. So we are an extended family, and as such, we must rank society in a hierarchy as well. So at the very top is the state. The monarch is like the father figure. He's the father of the family, in other words, and he's making the decisions for everybody else. Okay? So this is the way we should organize ourselves. In order to create order and stability, we must understand that we are, once again, number one, a family, and that we must acknowledge that there are people that are our elders, people that are our betters. In other words, that we must honor them, we must respect them, we must respect our fathers, we must respect our grandparents, we must respect our landlords, the local landlord. He's also our better as well. And we must respect also the monarch as well, because this is a gigantic clan, so to speak. So China society is a family writ large, in other words, okay? A society writ large. Respect and honor the elders, but also the ancestors, all the people that came before us, okay? There are also our elders and our betters, and we must maintain our links, our communication with our ancestors by paying homage to them. So we must carry out ancestor worship, ancestor rituals to honor our ancestors, because we're honoring the clan and we're reinforcing our bonds with one another. Again, so ancestor worship is central to Confucianism. Now, the emperor, as I said, he is the father figure of Chinese society, because Chinese society is a family. But according to Confucianism, the monarch must rule, not in an absolute way, but rather he has to rule over the family with benevolence, with goodwill. In other words, that he is just like any father trying to provide for the general welfare of the population. He's trying to take care of the people below him because he is the father, in other words. So he's responsible for their welfare. So again, this is placed an enormous responsibility on the monarch, that the monarch must behave well, must act in accordance to virtue, and must keep the population safe, for example, and provide for their needs as well. So this is how we maintain social order. We must build a hierarchy. We must obey and comply with our betters that are on top of the hierarchy. We must respect them. And this is how we maintain social order. He introduces this idea of Ren, social order through Ren. What is Ren? Again, according to Confucianism, again, respectability, honor, goodwill, kindness, compassion for one another, but most importantly, goodwill, responsibility, compliance, loyalty with our betters as well. If we cultivate those attitudes of Ren, we maintain social order. So again, this is really a philosophy, a social philosophy of social conformity, that we should conform in society to the place in which we are and obey those that are on top of society, because ultimately we're a big family, so we're just obeying our elders in this regard. In other words, we must respect them. Now, Daoism is another philosophy that emerges during the Warring State period. It was innovated by Lao Tzu. He lived in the 5th century BC. He was also considered a very wise individual, an enlightened sage of sorts. He's remembered as such. And he's also going to innovate another philosophy in order to maybe rescue Chinese civilization and trying to recreate it in a new fashion. Now, Daoism is totally different from Confucianism in that this is a more mystical philosophy. Okay, it's not so much of a social philosophy, but more mystical. Lao Tzu, again, introduces the notion that first and foremost, remember, they're trying to understand nature, and from understanding nature, organizing society according to that understanding of nature. Okay, just like Confucius. But Lao Tzu believes that in nature there is unity. He says, there is actual unity in everything. He's largely influenced by this symbol of yin and yang, as a matter of fact, the unity of all polarity. Okay, so he said, well, there's oneness in life. Everything is united. Everything is connected. Everything is just one single cosmos, in other words, and everything functions just as one entity. Okay, so he starts under that premise. And so as such, the universe, or this unity in life, this unity in nature, is guiding every movement and is guiding every motion of the universe in a perfect rhythm, in a perfect synchronicity. He believed there's perfect order already in the universe, okay, in nature. The way the seasons work, the way the celestial bodies move across the sky, the way the wind moves, etc., that there's perfect synchronicity, perfect rhythm, perfect order in everything. So we must align, once again, with that flow of energy. So that flow of energy, he called it the Tao. Okay, the Tao is the way of the universe, or the way of nature, the natural ebb and flow of the natural rhythms, the seasons, the energy of nature. That we must not fight it, we must not resist it, but rather we must go with the flow. In other words, life as flow. Okay, not creating resistance, not trying to control nature, not trying to control other people, not trying to control the environment, for example, but rather work with it, align with it, and life is going to become very, very easy, very smooth, and very gracious as well. The Tao, according to Lao Tzu, also is within us. It speaks not in words in our mind, but in intuition. It's inner knowingness. It's this inner knowledge. It's knowledge without words as well. It's every impulse that we feel within ourselves to do something, for example, is called intuition, inner knowingness, in other words, that we should also align ourselves with that intuition and not so much rely on our mental churning, on our intellect and our reason. He really disdained the intellect, the human intellect and reason as obstacles to the Tao. That because we pay attention to so much to our minds, we become very stressed, in other words. We fill our minds with so much knowledge that our brains become cluttered with so many ideas that we become very confused. And then out of that confusion, we fight with one another. We're trying to impose our ideas, our knowledge on each other. In other words, so that is the beginning of quarrel, the beginning of warfare, in other words. So he's really trying to get away from that, and instead he's trying to advocate for people to not accumulate knowledge and read books, for example, not be concerned with that, but instead trying to listen to our inner beings in a very quiet way. So what is the Taoist ideal? The Taoist ideal, again, is to live in harmony with nature. Once again, to be in harmony with nature, in simplicity and tranquility, away from civilized life. He really rejected civilization. He believed that civilized life was perhaps one of the evils, again, that people had created, with knowledge. And when we acquire knowledge, we build cities. And when people live in cities, we live very stressful lives. And we started pretty much fighting with one another, imposing our points of view. Instead, he wants to retreat from the city. He wants to go into the wilderness, into the quiet spaces outside of civilized life, to be in touch with the elements of nature, with the oxygen, with the rhythms, the currents of nature. And in that, we find unity. In other words, that is the ideal, to find unity with everything else. And so the ideal for him is not the intellectual, it's not the merchant, it's not the administrator or the monarch living in a city or in a town, but rather the peasant. Again, the peasant is the ideal person according to Daoism, because the peasant lives in the countryside, he's in touch with nature, he's in touch with the soil, with the elements, with the moisture, with the rain, etc. So he's more content because he is really working with the rhythms. He's synchronized with the rhythms of nature as he's trying to grow crops. So out of this, we're going to see a romanticism in ancient China about the peasant life, that the peasant was the most important figure, the most important member of society, because they were in contact with nature, but they were also feeding society. They were producing, everything that needed to be produced to sustain Chinese civilization, this peasant ideal. Again, so how do we create order according to Daoism? Again, move away from the city, get in touch with yourself and harmonize with nature. Okay, harmonize with nature. Now, the other philosophy that we're going to see flourishing during the Warring States period that was very different from Confucianism and Daoism was legalism. Legalism was the philosophy developed by the philosopher Han Feizi, who lived in ancient China from 280 to 233 BC, precisely during the Warring States period. Now, Han Feizi is not going to develop, a nice philosophy, for example, like Daoism, getting in touch with yourself, the rhythms of nature, and or Confucius, that you have to be kind, you have to be benevolent, that the king has to be like a father figure, taking care of the people, the welfare of the population. This philosopher introduces a whole different notion about human societies and human nature altogether. He believed that the problem in the world was really humans, that human nature, again, is not really good. He had a very pessimistic view of human nature. He said that by nature, humans are greedy, they're prone to anger, that by nature we're aggressive, we're driven by passions and lust, for example. So we're very inclined to misbehave and to wage war on one another, and that the only way that we can create order in society is through sheer force. Okay? Because human nature is not good. We're not born good, he said, but rather human beings are born prone to destroy one another, to destroy the environment, to misbehave, to steal, to wage war, etc. That we're wicked, in other words, by nature. So it's very pessimistic. So how do we create then an orderly society if human beings have such a wicked nature? Well, you need then a totalitarian state. You need a monarch that will exercise absolute totalitarian control over the population. And that monarch is going to enforce the law by force, by sheer force. Again, this is the only way that people can be scared into compliance. In other words, behaving well and respecting one another. In other words, that the threat of punishment, in other words, and it has to be real, not just the threat of punishment. The punishment has to be severe. In many cases, the punishment had to be met, with death as well. Even the smallest infraction of the law have to be met with death as well. So it's called legalism because he believed that the king is the law of the land. Whatever he said is law. Okay? So everything he thinks, everything he says that must be done, he needs to actually pass it into law, and that law is totally unbroken, and everybody has to obey it, or it has to be punished by death. Okay? Otherwise, people will be punished by death, in other words. So the king embodies the law. He exercises total control over the domain. He doesn't share power with anybody else. All power is vested in him, and he has to rule with an iron fist the population, and that is the only way we can save civilization. That's according to him. So this is a very different concept from Confucius. Remember, Confucius believes that, the king is like a father figure because Chinese society is an extended family, so he has to oversee the welfare of the population. In this regard, we see the total opposite of that. Again, in legalism, the king is the absolute ruler of the realm, and he has to be obeyed in everything. Okay, so very different philosophies, very, very different ways of trying to save civilization from this demise, from the warring state period. Confucius advocates for a more hierarchical, more benevolent system, cultivating good behavior and respect to the elders. Daoism, getting in touch with one's, being and creating unity, in tranquility, away from the cities. And legalism is more of a totalitarian state, that's how you save society. So the afterthought, what do we learn from those philosophies that we just looked at? Well, Confucianism is going to be a philosophy that is going to be very appealing to the nobility of China. We talked about the landed aristocracy, the powerful clans, for example, in China, that control land, for example, and they rule over the region, etc. Well, they're going to actually be very receptive to that philosophy because it's a philosophy that advocates for conformity, that there is a hierarchy in society, and because the nobility are in the upper echelons of the hierarchy, they really like that idea. They said, yes, we must continue with this hierarchical system. People must understand that some people are below the hierarchy and there are betters, there are people that are above them that must be respected and honored, of course. So the nobility is going to be very receptive, and they're going to adopt it, as we'll see, for many, many centuries after Confucius' death, of course. It will become one of the major philosophical schools that is going to be driving the Chinese state, as we'll see. Daoism found a great reception not among the nobility, but among the peasantry. Remember, the peasant is the ideal, the peasant ideal. This is the person that lives in the countryside, away from the cities. He's the one, living, with the flow of nature. They are in the Tao, in other words. They are living under the rhythms, the cycles of nature. They're in touch with the elements of nature and the like. So Daoism, this mystical philosophy, is going to be a philosophy largely adopted by the peasantry. And remember that Chinese civilization is an agricultural civilization. So it has a large peasant society. So Daoism will become one of the most popular philosophies/religions of ancient China, because the peasant found, of course, a lot of connections with that. And of course, it was a philosophy in which people needed to kind of close their eyes, meditate, find themselves, something similar to what happened in India. But in ancient China, Daoism was also turned into a kind of religious expression in which people built temples, and there were rituals performed to Lao Tse and other deities. So it also took a kind of popular folk religious expression as well. Legalism is going to be a philosophy that is going to be favored by the kings and the emperors, of course, because legalism calls for a totalitarian state, empowering the king in an absolute way. The king is the law. Everything the king says has to be obeyed. So kings in ancient China, or emperors, really try to adopt legalism as their main philosophy for ruling China as well. Now, last but not least, something to be taken into consideration when we talk about ancient China is, despite the fact that we see a flourishing of three main philosophical schools that are going to be dominant in China, there were, of course, a great many other philosophies that were flourishing at the same time. And as a whole, we can see that Chinese society was very eclectic when it came to religious beliefs and practices. Again, we see this religious eclecticism in China, in that even within the same household, the members of each family worship different deities. They practice different religions. They practice ancestor worship. They practice fertility rituals. Some of them were Taoists, for example. Some of them follow Confucius, etc. And that also happened even within the major temples of China. Even in the main temples of China, you'll find so many different deities side by side. They understood that the cosmos was populated by a multiplicity of different spirits, that there was no problem with that, in other words. So it's a very eclectic culture when it comes to religious beliefs and practices, when it comes to philosophy. However, three main philosophical schools are going to dominate, and they're going to dominate even the subsequent eras that we're going to be looking at after this in part 3 and in part 4. Okay, so this is all I have for you. We come to the end of session 2. When we come back, we're going to look at part 3. We're going to see the rise of the Chinese Empire, how and why it was built, the individual that built it. Again, that he's going to actually unify all the warring states and conquer them and create an empire. And we're going to see how after that unification, subsequent dynasties are going to carry on that imperial system, that imperial order. We're going to look also in part 4 at the very end, how the empire expanded and how it conflicted, other groups outside their borders. We're going to see conflicts with nomads, for example, the challenges that the empire faced with nomadic groups and the like. All of that will be assessed. It will be explained in session 3, our last session for this topic. This is all I have for you. Thank you, and I'll see you in the next session. Thank you.